Across the globe, justice systems are being reimagined through trauma-informed care, desistance theory, and neuroscience. At the forefront of this movement stands a voice for change, a trainer of professionals, and a storyteller committed to evidence-based reform. This is The Criminologist, the podcast exploring the people, the practices, and the possibilities shaping a more humane justice system. And now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 232 of The Criminologist Podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Arvidsson, founder of the Criminologist Media Group, Fulbright specialist, and co-creator of the TIDES supervision model. This week, I am honored to welcome a guest who is helping to redefine what community supervision can be. Laura Elliott isn't just leading change, she's living it. As the Assistant Director of Community Corrections in Floyd County, Indiana, Laura brings a rare blend of insight, professional integrity, and creative vision to our field. You may know her name from her thoughtful Beyond Supervision newsletter, where she raises the kinds of questions many of us have asked in the break room or on the drive home, but that we rarely see talked about out loud. Questions about identity, connection, officer wellness, and the future of supervision itself. In this episode, we talk about the emotional labor of the work, the role of partnership in recovery, and the deep impact that comes from truly believing in someone, even when the system is still unsure. Laura's story is a reminder that the people doing this work and the people under supervision are more than just checklists and outcomes. They're human beings, shaped by relationships, reflection, and hope. So, whether you are a probation officer, a policymaker, a reformer, or someone simply curious about where our field is headed, this conversation is one you'll want to really lean into. So please enjoy my conversation with Laura Elliott, and I'll see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the Criminologist Podcast, Laura. So glad we could finally connect. Lots to talk about. I'm a big fan of yours and what you're doing down there in Indiana. Why don't we begin, as I often do with my guest, just kind of tell the listeners a little bit of the pathway that you've been on, what your trajectory has looked like, those decisions you made that ended up with you and I talking on the Criminologist Podcast today.
So I started my career in public safety about 15 years ago. I have a degree in criminal justice and criminology, and my minor's in psychology. I've always been drawn to the system. I've always wanted to help others. I've worked with both adults and juveniles in different areas. I worked at the Department of Child Services first, and then I switched over to probation, and I worked at probation before I switched over to community corrections. And I've been at community corrections now since the end of 2021.
Let me ask you a question, Laura, because when you were rattling off your resume, as you know, a lot of us do when we present or teach or speak, whatever. Let me ask you a question. I'm going to date myself because when I, also a fellow criminal justice major, when I was taking my undergraduate work, my graduate work, if you took a corrections course back then, and this would have been for me, dating myself, the mid to late 80s, you learned about jails and prisons, and in hindsight, I didn't think that they were really preparing the next generation of community corrections officers because, again, corrections was the institution side. You did mention that you did also, good for you, sprinkle in some criminology and psychology. But I guess my question is, coming out of university, before you landed that first job in the field, did you feel academically that you were situated pretty well?
I did. The mix of our classes that I took, it was more law enforcement, prison-based, but they were starting to branch out to the community supervision side of it.
Yeah, I know, and my listeners know that I did a stretch of a couple of decades, actually, as an adjunct faculty member. But when a local university approached me here to teach what was entitled Probation and Parole 370, it was for that very reason. They realized, and I was nestled within their criminal justice department, so with the law enforcement folks, obviously. But yeah, they saw that need, that we're not preparing graduates when they sit down with Floyd County probation or, wherever one may be, that they're not getting the academic background of what this job is really all about. And even then, and again, I'll date myself, when I look at the first syllabi, I guess is the plural of syllabus, the first syllabi that I cranked out, it was really a how-to manual. It was sort of embarrassing in hindsight because it was really about, figuring out sentencing guidelines grids or literally the nuts and bolts of when an officer files a probation violation. But those early classes I taught, it was scant, if any, talk around evidence-based practices, which I always tell folks, boy, you look at the syllabus that I did year one versus the syllabus for the same course I was doing year 20, and it's night and day. It's I would tell kids, listen to me, I would tell students on the first day of my probation or parole class, you're essentially going to be in a criminology class, because that's what probation officers are. They're behavioral scientists. They're criminologists. They're not law enforcement officers or containment officers. But I would contend that maybe is why you turned out to be such a great practitioner, is because you had that more well-rounded background.
I think it helped me a lot. And also, when I first graduated, my first job was as a dispatcher for the sheriff's department, which also gave me a great insight to the other side of the system.
Correct.
So that helped out a lot.
Yeah. It's great to get those varied backgrounds in the field. Yeah, that's another thing I always tell hiring managers is you look for those people that have that diverse, in that sense, that diverse background of system background or dealing with marginalized people or just getting the bigger picture, really, because that's really, I would say, we could likely get into this during this conversation. One of the challenges of community corrections now is how do we take a more holistic lens and apply it to our clients? And that entails knowing what their experience is going to be like with law enforcement, what their experience is going to be like with chemical dependency practitioners, what their experience is going to be like with housing managers or, that type of thing. Because that's what it really takes for us to get our clients to desist, not just understanding, as I used to teach 20 years ago, the nuts and bolts of go to the clerk's office, request, an affidavit for a warrant, attend the PV hearing, that kind of thing. It's like, well, and that's the intern side of the job. That's just like how to get through the job, but that's not really, really what a good change agent is all about. So that was your background, and then you were hired then. So you went from a dispatcher then, and then how did you get into the community corrections side?
So from the dispatching, I went to the Department of Child Services. And so I was a case manager there. We did, there was like an assessment case manager and ongoing case manager. And I did both of those. But then I really wanted to work on the other side and work with criminals, because the Department of Child Services is a great program, but it's very structured. So it gave me a lot of my structure, which is super helpful. But I wanted to work with the other population.
And that's great. I always tell, again, hiring managers when they're coming to me for advice on who to hire, and they look at an individual's resume, and they might see all the usual suspect bullet points of this training certificate or this degree. And I stole this phrase from somebody else, but it's, I can always, as an EBP trainer, I would tell them, I can always coach somebody up on motivational interviewing. I can always train somebody on risk assessment. I can always train somebody up on the use of cognitive behavior interventions, but I can't take what you just articulated, Laura, that drive that to help people essentially. So the phrase I always would drop on hiring managers was hire to the will, train to the skill. You've got to find their why, whether it's helping people or I believe in the absolute worth of people or everybody has a brighter future. And don't get so hung up on the certificates that they have in their back pocket. I can get them that. That's easy. But it's finding the why are you doing this?
Yeah.
Right.
One of the ones that I can have it, plenty of certificates, and be certified in a million different things. But if I'm not able to apply it in my actual job,
right,
then I mean,
right.
that kind of
and I've
defeats
even
the
seen
purpose of
folks that
having
collect
it.
those as sort of they understand. Well, that's what the next hiring manager is going to look for. Am I an LACMI trainer? Am I an MI trainer? And even as a master trainer of some of those things, I would say, I don't want you people signing up for this if your motivation is just to augment your resume so you can get promoted. But speaking of getting promoted, so, okay, I'm going to keep following your connecting the dots here. So then eventually you did then tiptoe into community corrections from, was it child services?
So in Indiana, we're separate. Probation and community corrections are separate. So I went to probation, and I was at probation since 2014. And then in 2021, I switched over to community corrections, which, depending on what state and what county you're in, it's all similar. But in our county, we have probation who are judicial officers, and then we have community corrections who are county employees. And we do the electronic monitoring for clients in jail or.
Yeah, we have kind of a strange delivery system of corrections here in my home state of Minnesota, as opposed to, for example, the great state of Florida, where I started my career. They just have that monolithic one delivery system. If you're a PO in Florida, you work for the Department of Corrections. The governor of Florida signs your paychecks. Whereas other states like yours and mine, and I think like Illinois is one of those sort of hybrid where it's like, no, some of the POs report to the sentencing judges and some report to a county and the state. And yeah, so I get it. I was talking to some colleagues over in Europe who their heads spin when they hear that kind of thing, because they realize, okay, we understand that not only do you have 50 different states administering corrections, but within those 50 states, like we just talked about within Minnesota and Indiana, there's a half a dozen correctional delivery systems just in those two states. And then they wonder why, we're trying to get closer to some sort of national probation standards, which is bonkers that we don't have that. But that's a big hurdle list to get over, is, well, you understand we're not all starting from the same place even. So then tell me about those early experiences as a line staff officer. What did you like? What didn't you like? I want to get into your ascent into management and leadership in a little bit here, but what were some of your early observations when you got into the trenches with carrying a caseload?
That was my favorite part of it all. It really was. I still miss it. And I still have a small caseload today, but whenever I was at probation, I obviously had a higher case level. But I enjoyed it, and it was my favorite job by far, just because I got to work with the clients. Yeah,
that's so constantly. Great to hear, Laura, but also not surprising when I talk to people who have gotten into, like I said, either, as in your case, a leadership position, or, say, for example, in my case, where I get into training world, and the last 10, 12 years of my career, I didn't carry a caseload, but I would talk to other EBP trainers, and to a person, we would all say, yeah, the one thing we miss about not carrying a caseload, or as we were saying before we hit the record button, waking up on a Monday morning to see who got arrested over the weekend, but we miss that client interaction. And I can say, yeah, from my perspective, as an evidence-based practice trainer, I miss seeing the things that we train actually land on the client work, right? It's almost like you're going from the laboratory and the X's and O's of the chalkboard of like, no, you're seeing that person's face light up when, oh, they understand a problem-solving exercise you went through, or you're trying some engagement techniques you learned about, or role clarification or something, and it's like, holy crap, that actually works, boss. Like, yeah, it does. So yeah, I miss that sort of, we talk about the value of instant feedback. I don't get that. I train someone who then I trust they're going to do it with a client who I trust is going to respond to it. But yeah, I miss that frontline staff. So that's great to hear. Hold on to that. You always need that wherever you go in your career. Is don't forget as we talked about, like why you get into it. Well, helping people. Right. Yeah, that's the biggest. So spoiler alert, I mentioned you eventually then got into a leadership role. You are now the assistant director of community corrections. What did you bring with you from carrying a caseload, or what, sort of values do you still bring along with you now that you're in that leadership role to help make the great changes that you're making down there in Indiana?
I took a lot of the structure from probation over to community corrections along with the director. We both came from probation. So we switched over and we tried to keep the structure the same because that's what we knew. And that's what we had been doing for years. And the terms and conditions were the same. But then making sure that we're able to train our staff to also be able to use it daily and, understand it.
Let me ask you a question, because this is something that I see a lot sometimes when there's a disconnect, for lack of a better term. But in my experience, I've seen a lot of agencies that they make a big investment into their employee development, their employee training. That, of course, entails being trained up in evidence-based practices. And sometimes I witness, ironically, it's almost kind of like this glass ceiling, right? That, they believe in that. They're invested in that. They want, this is the style, for example, that they want their probation officers to engage and communicate with their clients because they know there's efficacy behind these best practices. But then when I refer to the glass ceiling, what I see sometimes in other agencies is that sort of stops when they get so far up the food chain, right? It's like, yeah, but that's not the way middle management is talking to supervisors, and that's not the way leadership is talking to middle management. You're not engaging, you're not involved in active listening, that kind of thing. It's this sort of weird, ironic disconnect, right? Where I'll say, oh my goodness, if the assistant director was talking to a client like that, they'd be working overnights, but that's just how they routinely go in and talk to the supervisors. They don't see the irony here of being human-centered when you talk to clients, but yeah, when I talk to you as a staff member, it's still my way or the highway kind of thing. Can you relate to that? Or are there things that you've done to sort of avoid that and say, no, what's good for the goose is good for the gander? I need to model these behaviors if I want them to, for lack of a better term, trickle down to my staff members and by extension to their clients.
I highly believe that I have to be a role model for everybody, not just my staff, but also to myself and my clients. And if I'm not doing it, then how can I expect them to? I can't, in my opinion. It's like, I just can't. So for me, I don't want to ask them to do something that I'm not going to do. And that's too why I want to stay active with having clients, so I'm not out of date on what's going on, and I'm still keeping, intact with the day-to-day challenges that they face that they come into.
It's an old baseball reference. You're sort of Pete Rose, player coach, kind of thing, right? No, but I love it. You stay up to speed with what's going on. And to my point earlier about, sort of seeing with your own eyes what works in these interventions and whatnot. Yeah, you kind of keep a foot in both worlds. I love it. And I'm sure you have more respect from your staff members as well, who say to themselves, well, Laura doesn't just talk the talk, she walks the walk. LinkedIn is sort of my new Facebook. It's my big social media landing spot, at least professionally. So I follow a lot of your posts on LinkedIn, and I absolutely love your Beyond Supervision newsletter. It is such a unique contribution to the field. Maybe just give us some background, what inspired it, and what are you really trying to elicit with those conversations? What engagement are you trying to spark with your readers?
Beyond Supervision came out of a desire to break out of the status quo in our field. So much of what we do is focus on compliance and risk and paperwork that sometimes we're not able to actually show what we're doing and that we see the people that we're working with. So I wanted to be able to show what we're doing. Yes, compliance, we're making sure people, but also we're actually trying to help our clients change and give them the resources that they need to become productive citizens.
Yeah, I think it really does a good job of humanizing our clients, right? Obviously, the listeners of this podcast know my tagline when I sign off every episode is there's no them, there's only us. But it's that same kind of thing. There's such stigma and bias involved with those that we serve that's what I really appreciate about that newsletter is you're giving the sort of behind the curtain look to it, a day in the life, which I appreciate as well. So to any listeners who are not yet connected to Laura Elliott on LinkedIn, A, I encourage you to do so, but then B, track down her Beyond Supervision newsletter. It's just a really cool, innovative way of changing the public relations battle that we're undergoing in this field, which I think we really are sort of under a change and trying to figure out even for ourselves what the vocation is becoming. I know I oftentimes talk to guests about, and I know you've heard the old cliche, we wear two hats, right? And I'm almost coming to bristle at that because I think, we really don't wear two hats. They play that as, well, one day you're a social worker, one day you're a law enforcement. And I think when we tell people you wear two hats, it really only gives them license to find where they fall on that continuum and say, oh, I can do this because Joe said I have two hats. So if you want to be more in the social worker, Mary Poppins lane, 4 out of 5 days of the week, you can say, yep, I wear two hats. But then that also gives somebody license. Well, I can be containment officer, John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, 4 out of the 5 days, Dirty Harry. And Joe said, that's fine because I wear two hats. It's like, no, you're neither. You're a change agent. You've got to find a way to bundle those together because the client sure doesn't see that. They see either, oh, I got Mary Poppins as my PO or I got Clint Eastwood as my PO, right? So again, I bristle want to hear we wear two hats. What's your experience been like, again, I suppose with your staff members who are trying to go through their own sort of role clarification? How do you help them address that balance of, yes, some days you are strictly containment, rule enforcement, and other days you are a change agent, a helper?
It's hard sometimes because what I've noticed is sometimes they take it personal and they can't. And this is a job. We're here to do it. It's tough, but don't take it personal. And you are both. So you can still hold them accountable, but also guide them and give them the resources they need and put them in the treatment that they need to help them. And not just by telling them that, but by showing them, like having our own clients, and they can see us working with our own clients and how we're interacting with them. That helps a lot. And
mention to folks, with a new PO or maybe an old PO who's getting ready to retire and he doesn't want anything to do with evidence-based practice, but I'll say, okay, listen, if there's one thing you could put in your toolkit, embrace Chris Trotter's role clarification. If you could just clarify your role with your client and take the guesswork and the ambiguity out of the nature of that relationship, that's one thing you can do to get better results. In fact, that's what his research showed with non-voluntary populations. For those who failed, the biggest failure was around, again, uncertainty about the nature of that relationship. So yeah, role clarification goes a long way of getting at what you just said, taking the guesswork out of even what my role is as the practitioner. When you were speaking earlier about your career trajectory and some of the other roles you had, and I know you've highlighted things like peer recovery services, even stuff like GPS monitoring as what I would call innovative supervision tactics. How do you see those tactics moving forward? How do this sort of all of the above approach help clients desist from crime?
Those two tools. So the peer recovery coach, when we first came over to community corrections, that's one thing that we didn't have. We had them in our area, but we didn't have them in our office. So we got a peer recovery coach in our office for our clients in probation, that they're there when we are, and we can send our clients directly to them. Firsthand experience and lived experience goes so far compared to what I can sit here and tell somebody, hey, this is how you do this, and it's not going to matter because they're going to say to me, well, you've never done this before. You haven't been in my shoes. But if I'm able to say, okay, but this person has, so go talk to them, and they can talk to them about stuff that.
Yeah, on that topic of peer recovery coaches, and you went right there with the practice of utilizing individuals with lived experience. when I see changes on the horizon, I think that's one that we'll look back and say, oh my gosh, are you kidding me? Grandpa, when you were a probation officer, you never used people with lived experience? Nope. In fact, it was taboo. It was like, how dare you, you can't even come into this building because you're a convicted felon type thing, and A, shame on us, but B, just how short-sighted is just laid out there. Yes, I can give you skills and I can give you tools, but there's something, again, with that sort of relatability that you've got to get it from the source, or at least it's an added layer of communication that we're really just not tapping into. I was talking once with, I believe it was Shad Maruna, who was talking about this phenomenon of relying on folks who've desisted as sort of our ultimate subject matter experts. And he said, the best way to get out of a minefield is to follow the footsteps of the person who ahead of you who got through it successfully, right? And he said to me, and I can say it to you, I was like, I could say to a client, like, yep, I've got all these, we mentioned certificates and advanced degrees and all these research articles I've got stacked in my office here. But I've never desisted from crime. I've never walked through that minefield. So I don't know what that pathway looks like. But I can connect you with somebody, a peer recovery specialist, who could tell you what their process was. And again, I think it speaks to how naive we've been in corrections, thinking as the experts, so to speak, that there's only one way out of that minefield, and it's my way. It's like, no. So let me ask you this, Laura, then. If there is an agency out there and they're sort of on the fence about utilizing folks with lived experience or establishing some sort of peer recovery services you've done there, what's your 30-second elevator speech on, oh no, you need to do this if you really want to move the needle on promoting desistance from crime?
Do it. It is motivation for all clients, and it's motivation for the officers too, because you can see somebody who has been through the system, who has, been through recovery and is still in recovery. It's motivation for everybody.
Now, share the story about a former client thanking you for believing in them. And I just love those kind of moments of like, okay, see, I'm doing something right here. It's those sort of human touches versus the bar graphs and the statistics. But reshare that story if you wouldn't mind.
So this was a probation client that stopped by community corrections office one day, and he just wanted to say, hey, but when he came in, he said, hey, I'm still alive. And I was like, I'm so glad, I'm so glad to see you. I'm glad you're alive. And he was like, I had to go do jail time. And when I got out, he was like, I went straight to my dealer's house. I relapsed. I got hospitalized because I overdosed. After that, though, I stopped completely. And he was like, but if it wasn't for you and the help that you gave me and for revoking his time, and he had to, go to jail and do time for it, but he came to thank me. And that was huge because you don't see that often. Or you do, and it's like a third party telling you about someone's doing well.
Right, exactly. And as I was saying, that's the type of feedback we get that's not about the hardcore recidivism data or jail populations, crime trends, that kind of thing. It's just, like you said, bumping into somebody like that. And they're like, yep, you altered my life. Like you changed my life. That's insane to think of, but yeah, that's really our job. But we just don't get that feedback.
And it's nice too, because it keeps you going. And he didn't know I had switched over to community corrections, but they made sure that they found me just to tell me that. So it meant a lot, and it keeps me going.
Yeah, I've had those experiences as well back more when I was carrying a caseload. And sometimes it was the case with me of the person who was giving that heavy duty affirmation like you just described there. When I would think back, I thought, wow, and you didn't really even stand out as somebody on my caseload that I thought I was having this impression on. You know what I mean? You kind of think in your head, like, oh yeah, this is the person that I really, really laid in the interventions, and I really laid into the engagement, and I really did the EBP playbook. But sometimes it's just somebody random who you might even barely remember, like, no, you really turned my life around, Laura, kind of thing. And that's, again, what just really fills your heart and keeps you going. So related to this, you are currently collaborating with somebody who you did once supervise. Can you tell us more about that partnership and really what it represents for you, both professionally and personally?
Back during COVID, when I was a probation officer, I got a client who had just completed community corrections, HIP, electronic monitoring, and they had to come serve their probation time. But COVID hit during all that, so it was a little up and down, but he still reported to me, and he was doing well already by the time I got him. And then when I switched over to community corrections at the end of 2021, when we tried to get the peer recovery services in to our office, I had reached out to one of our community partners. They're called Clark and Floyd System of Care. And I said, I really want to get a peer recovery coach in here. Do you have any ideas? And they said, sure, let me hook you up with Thrive Recovery. And it's a peer recovery agency, and we'll set up a meeting. So we set up a meeting, and then at that meeting, my former client walks in, and he was the peer recovery coach at our office. And so now, because he has all of this experience from dealing to using drugs to jail to prison, and then electronic monitoring to probation, to now getting he was supposed to be off of probation, I think, in 2038. And they modified him last year, so he's completely done with probation. So he has no paper anymore. And he's also now a member of our local JRAC and Community Corrections Board.
Wow. So to be clear, I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. He was working with you while still on supervision, while still on paper, as we say?
Yes.
Not that I'm judging that, Laura. I'm actually very pleased to hear that, because I know for many agencies, and there's a lot of agencies all over the country, but, that's sort of their red line is like, well, get off supervision first, get your civil rights back or whatever it is in your particular state, and then we can talk.
This was allowed because our county wasn't supervising him anymore, and a different county was, and we got approval from our board to allow it. And because he was giving back so much to the community, they already knew who he was, they knew what he was doing, and so they approved it.
Wow, what a great story. And kudos to you and all your stakeholders down there for seeing the bigger picture and not getting hung up on the technicalities or those red lines or that just closed-minded thinking. Yeah, I just love that. Yeah. There's something in the water down there in Indiana, Laura. I swear to God, you guys are doing something right.
I think everybody works together, and they're so supportive of every agency, and we all work together for the same goal and same purpose. And I think that helps everything.
So when you say everyone works together, you're talking interagency cooperation then? Like your mental health folks, your chemical dependency folks, your housing folks?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's music to my ears. One thing that it's been a quest of mine, because I noticed it back when I was a practitioner, was, and I keep going back to that word holistic, but we just have our own, as good as we may be in our own particular silo, the fact is we just have too many silos. Right. And I always tell the story. Okay, so my client can come see me, a probation officer, on Monday. And then on Tuesday, they're going to go to their chemical dependency provider. And on Wednesday, they're going to their mental health provider. And on Thursday, they might be seeing somebody with housing. But guess what? None of us are going to talk to each other. None of us are going to communicate with each other. And then we wonder why our client just sort of gets these different messages, and we don't even speak the same language. We're not using the same assessment. We're not utilizing the same case plan goals or anything like that. And I'm being a little bit sarcastic. I mean, I might get a call from a chemical dependency agency or whatnot, but even then, I was talking to a former colleague about this. Even then, I can remember back in the day, there would be reticence sometimes for the chemical dependency folks to share updates with probation because they thought, oh, if I report this relapse to you as part of my overall chemical dependency progress report, that might trigger a probation violation and you might issue a warrant for this guy. So I'm going to withhold that from you. kind of thing. But again, it was just so disjointed. So it doesn't surprise me when you said in response to my question, Laura, what's in the water down there? It's collaboration. It's communication. I mean, that's an old project management truism that the number one reason projects fail is lack of communication. And if you think of what we're trying to do for our clients as a project, they'll go, yeah, you know why it fails? It's because this client has so many stakeholders in their lives and none of them are talking to each other. But if they all did, that'd be so great.
I think that's one of the biggest things that helps us, the collaboration part of it. But also that's one reason why I started posting on LinkedIn too, is so everybody knows what we're doing and trying to do. Is it perfect? No. But are we working to get it as good as we can? Absolutely. And communication is key with everything.
It really is. And transparency goes so far. Like you said, communication is key to everything. And then it gets at, I mentioned stigma earlier and bias and just these preconceived notions that even other stakeholders have, that they don't know what we do, Laura, right? I mean, I know for a chapter of my career before I get into training world, the last dedicated caseload that I had as an adult probation officer for years, I strictly supervised high-risk adult street gang members. Mm-hmm. So I worked hand in hand with law enforcement. I would go to our local gang unit meetings and their intelligence meetings, and I was, accepted in that community. But the point of my story is it amazed me how little, not just rank and file officers had, but up their chain of command, like their commanders, their lieutenants, their sergeants, like, really, you don't know probation 101 type thing, which I'm not saying the layperson needs to, but a fellow criminal justice practitioner, you really should know a little bit about this. And they were just clueless.
And I think it's hard too for people to know just because it is different everywhere. Everywhere it's different. Right. But that's one reason why, I'm trying to get the word out, what we're here for, what we're doing. And if we are doing something that they are like, well, why are you doing that? I want them to know why, or be comfortable to ask me why.
Right. And then combat again that like, oh, you're soft on crime, or, well, that's a big one. But yeah, it's like, no, I always say, well, I'm playing the long game here. I mean, I could be, the ultimate sort of hall monitor and lock everybody up, every client up for a small infraction. But A, we know they're all going to get out. And B, again, I'm playing the long game. I'm making these investments in cognitive behavioral interventions and these engagement techniques and motivational interviewing and whatnot. And sometimes you just have to be a little bit more patient with that and not just be red letter of the law like a lot of folks in law enforcement and other vocations are. And
we're lucky, though, too, because we work real hand in hand with our sheriff's department and police departments, and they know what we're doing, why we're doing it. And also, too, they understand that if something happens, they know there has to be a reason of why she's not violating them. Or they know, hey, she's going to violate them.
Yeah.
This is, and my clients know that, too. When I go over the terms and conditions with them, I don't go over verbatim every single word because it can get confusing. I just say, hey, this isn't, I read them, but I make sure that they understand everything. And I tell them, these are the rules, you have to follow them. My job is to report to the courts if you break them. And I don't tell them that I'm not going to, if you break one, hey, you're going to jail. No. But do they think that at the first meeting? Yes. But then they find out that that's not the case. I'm here to help them.
But it gets back to what I said earlier about the value of role clarification. When you said earlier, if you're in a position where you have to file a probation violation, it should not come as a surprise to your client, at least not a total surprise. They might be a little bit in denial, but at the end of the day, if you've done a good job communicating and being transparent, and like you said, laying out, if you do this, it's negotiable. If you do this, it's non-negotiable. For example, failing to remain law-abiding or absconding from supervision. But yeah, you always used to tell probation officers who I trained, if you get a big FU when your client finds out that you violated them and it's truly coming as a surprise to them, like they didn't see it coming, then you drop the ball somewhere along the way. That it's gotten to this point of the sheriff's knocking on their door and they're like, what the heck? Like they should know.
Yes.
They should see it coming or you're not communicating with them. Right. Again, back to the communication piece. Laura, your presence at the Indiana University Southeast Mental Health Summit reflects a commitment to integrated care, which we've been talking about this entire interview. How do community partnerships like that really shape your work? Where do you see the real value added of those types of collaborations?
They're essential. We can't do this work in isolation. The events like the Mental Health Summit brings the courts, probation, community supervision officers, and all of us in the community and extra stakeholders present in one room so we can all collaborate together on where to go from here, and also just learn about what everybody's doing and keeping up to date on what everybody's doing.
Yeah, it kind of harkens back to what I said before about, if you look at this from the client's point of view, they would be shocked to learn that my probation officer has no clue what my mental health leadership is doing, and they have no idea what's going on in, chemical dependency world or in trauma world, for example. Like, nope, we just sort of hodgepodge this. So again, it's that whole communication thing. Speaking of the communication thing, I'm a big believer in continuing education, professional development. I'm a fixture at American Probation and Parole Association training institutes. And I know you've attended events like IACCAC, their spring conference. How do you take that information, pass it on to your team, or instill the value of professional development to your team in any of those type of events?
One of the biggest things is when I go to the conference, take back what I've learned, let my staff know what I've learned from it, but also being in a leadership position, the biggest thing I've learned is to listen to what they are saying. They need to be heard. What they're saying, has value, and just keep it open dialogue. Make sure that they know that they can come to us and talk about anything that they need to, and keep them, encourage them, and make sure that we are not out to date on our practices and standards.
Yeah, that's a big thing too, just staying up to date, if nothing else, and just sort of hearing the buzz of what's going on. I mean, I've been in this field long enough to know whether it's assessments or I can remember when the term desistance was first thrown out, and I thought, what's that? Kind of thing. Thank God I did. But to your point, if leadership doesn't keep up, I mentioned my work in academia earlier, and I often would tell people one of the fringe benefits for me as a adjunct faculty member was it sort of kept my feet to the fire that you have to keep up with this stuff. If there's something coming out that you just read about in Federal Probation Journal or whatnot, and your students are challenging you and they say, well, wait a minute, how come you're not doing this with EBP yet? It's like, oh, crap, I've got to be doing the latest and greatest. And that's what we get at these conferences, the latest and greatest. So glad you go back and share that with your team. Yeah, I've heard of agencies that when they sort of they resolve we don't have money in the budget to send everybody out of town for this conference. Sort of their quid pro quo was, okay, if whomever, Jack and Jill, if it's you this year, when you get back, you've got to give a presentation on the conferences that you attend, the workshops you attended, kind of a show and tell. Like, we didn't do this just to augment your professional skill set, but bring it back to the agency. Like you said, what are the trends you see out there? What's the next big thing that we don't want to be caught, sort of with our pants down because they've been doing this for years. We just didn't know about it. Again, Laura, it's all about communication, right?
I think that's probably one of the hardest things is to stay up to date with everything, with, the trends and just laws changing. It's so hard to stay up to date. That takes a lot of time, but it's so worth it because it's working.
Yeah. If there is one thing, I know you mentioned COVID earlier and the lockdowns and sort of the lessons learned. And a lot of that was obviously doing things virtually. But one thing I've seen now is, for example, organizations like APPA, they do offer a lot more virtual things if people can't make the physical, flight to New York City or wherever it may be. And they're still getting the word out that way. So again, I encourage folks, if you're a member and you can't attend or you have access, APPA's got a lot of great resources, and you don't necessarily have to physically go to those biannual training institutes to benefit from those.
I was fortunate to go to the one in Indianapolis last summer, but I won that trip through our probation association in the state of Indiana. But that was probably the best conference I've been to. And so then when I got back, I had asked that all of our staff become members so they can do the trainings online. And so we were able to do that.
Yeah, good for you. Good for you. Yeah, I attended the same conference. That was a good one in Indianapolis as well. Yeah. Laura, look into your crystal ball. What change do you most see in community corrections in the years ahead? If I have you back on the podcast in a few years, what do you think we might be talking about, or where do you see the profession going in the future?
I think it'll continue to shift toward a more human-centered, evidence-based approach that balances accountability, but also not just reentry, but with reintegration. Because we can try to reenter everybody, but we have to also reintegrate them. That's a huge thing I think sometimes people miss. Reentry is a process of leaving incarceration and returning to the community. It involves the logistics, supervision plans, housing, and job readiness, program referrals, but then the reintegration is the outcome that we hope to achieve with all that. So it's about building a life that works for them, just to say, so they can be self-sufficient and accountable and have a purpose. Reentry is what we do, and then the reintegration is why we're doing it.
Laura Elliott, Assistant Director of Floyd County Community Corrections. Thank you so much for joining the Criminologist today, Laura. I can't wait to have you back on the show, and I encourage all of my LinkedIn listeners to connect with Laura and really track down her Beyond Supervision newsletter. It is such a joy to see, and you're really moving the needle of change, Laura. Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, we'll talk soon. Take care.
Bye.
And that brings us to the close of another episode of the Criminologist Podcast. A huge thank you to Laura Elliott, not just for joining us today, but for the way she continues to model compassionate leadership and innovation in the field of community corrections. If today's conversation resonated with you, I strongly encourage you to check out Laura's newsletter, Beyond Supervision. In her most recent edition, she shares the inspiring full circle journey of Jordan, from supervision to peer leadership, and shows how real lives are transformed when we combine evidence-based practice with genuine human connection. I will be including a link to her Beyond Supervision newsletter in the show notes of this episode, so you can subscribe and stay informed. Trust me, this is a resource you'll want in your inbox. Until next time, thank you for tuning in, and always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
Beyond Supervision came out of a desire to break out of the status quo in our field. So much of what we do is focus on compliance and risk and paperwork that sometimes we're not able to actually show what we're doing and that we see the people that we're working with. So I wanted to be able to show what we were doing. Yes, compliance, we're making sure people, but also we're actually trying to help our clients change and give them the resources that they need to become productive citizens.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, training opportunities, program design, or interview requests, visit theparagongroup.llc.com. To learn more about the TIDES supervision model, a trauma-informed, desistance-based approach to community supervision, please visit TIDESLLC.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to check out the Criminologist YouTube channel for additional content, including exclusive video interviews and international insights. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Don't forget to give the show a 5-star review. And as always, thank you for listening.